There are a lot of problems in the region, and it all starts with the people themselves. The people are stupid, unfortunately, because if they were not stupid, they would not invite foreign intervention. Like what happened in Libya. Didn't we invite NATO to come and bomb Libya? So whose fault is it? Yeah, we are stupid. Sorry, that's how it is. Yeah. attend these sessions on a regular basis, just to keep track, because sometimes you do have glitches in the recording, so you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. You want to make sure that you are attending the sessions in their proper time and schedule. Okay, since there are no questions, I guess we will, well,
Yes, Professor.
yes.
Would you please go over that terms of trade major at the end of the class last session? Can you repeat
Yeah,
over?
I'm going to be going over it today.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Okay, just a few things I want to mention before we start, and that is the due date for all the homework assignments have been updated on Titanium. So please make sure that you go to Titanium and check when homework 3 is due, 4, 5, and 6 are due. So I have made all the changes, and all the due dates have been updated on Titanium. So this way you know exactly when each homework assignment is due. That's number one. Number two, as far as the midterm exam is concerned, the midterm exam will be held on Tuesday, not this coming Tuesday, but the Tuesday after, which would correspond to October 20th. Now, this Tuesday, we're going to be going over Chapter 7, and on Thursday, we will have a review session. And on Tuesday, we will have the exam. So is this very clear?
Yes.
Okay.
The exam's a week and a half from now.
Right. It's going to be on Tuesday, not this Tuesday, but the Tuesday after, which is October 20th. And the review session will be on Thursday. And on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, we will probably, if there is anything that we need to finish in as far as chapter 4, I doubt it, we will finish it today. But if there is anything, we will probably use the first 10 minutes or so going over that, and then the rest will be allocated towards covering chapter 7.
All right, Professor, how will the exam look like? Is it gonna be choices or short answers?
Multiple choice. All of it would be multiple choice.
All right.
There will be around 35 questions. You will see graphs in those questions, and you will be asked to find, well, we will go over it anyway. So we will leave that till Thursday when we have a review session.
Is the midterm covering chapter 1 through 4?
Yes.
Thank you.
How much time do we have?
1 hour, 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
So the exam will be on Zoom?
Yes. No, it will be on Titanium.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you just go on Titanium, go to the link where it says midterm exam. Can everyone see that on Titanium, the link for the midterm exam?
Yes.
Yeah, so just go there and then upload your answers through that link. You put your answers in a Word doc, and you just, it's going to be very simple. You're not going to be doing any writing. So what you'll be doing is you just be putting letters to indicate the answers. And yeah, so please make sure you do not write the questions and highlight the questions. This is what I had, during the past exams. Students actually rewriting the question, highlighting the answer. I don't need all of that because this takes a lot of time. So all what I need from you is just the number of the question and next to it the right answer, a letter indicating, in other words, if the answer is A, you put A. If the answer is B, you put B, whatever. So instead of
for the first exam, what's like the average usually?
Oh, the average grade?
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty high. It was about probably 80%.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so a lot of students did very well. In fact, all my classes, students do very well. There is no excuse for them not to. I mean, the ones that do not do well are the ones that don't take the class seriously. They really don't prepare for the exam. They don't attend classes. They do not submit homeworks. They write very bad paper. I mean, it adds up. So even if you do very well on the midterm and the final, and you don't do well on the homework and the paper, well, it's going to reduce your chances of getting an A, basically. So you got to do well on all cylinders. This is the key. Make sure you do not miss any homework assignment. And make sure you don't miss the writing assignment. I had students actually who never submitted a paper. And I had students who never submitted a homework assignment. And they did very well in the final and the midterm. But they ended up with a C. Because they got a 0 on homework, 0 on the paper.
That's easy points. That's easy
Yeah,
points.
easy points, exactly. So, if you want to get an A, you got to work on all cylinders. You can't just focus on the midterm and the final and think, hey, I'm going to do very well on the midterm and the final, therefore I'm going to get an A. Not really. You will never be able to get an A if you miss homework and you miss the paper. So it's very important. You got to do all of that. Okay. Yes. Go ahead.
Homework number 3. Do we have to do charts on that one too?
Yeah, the graph, yes.
Okay, so draw graphs like the other 2 homework assignments.
Exactly, right. And by the way, I'm going to be posting a similar question to the homework with answers. So this way, at least, it gives you a good idea of how to answer the homework, because maybe some of you are having a hard time answering the questions, I'm sure, but most of you don't. But if for any reason some of you are having a hard time, just go to the question that I will be posting with answers today, this afternoon. Hopefully I'll post that for you. And it's very similar to the homework question. And I have answered it, with the graph. I drew the graph and both the supply and demand, and I show you how to answer most of the questions. So you shouldn't have any problems attending the homework questions at all. You shouldn't have any problems solving the questions.
Can I say another quick question?
Yes.
For the writing assignment, I don't know if you read this book before, but I'm reading The Deficit Myth. Is that a good book for that writing assignment?
Which book?
Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton.
Yeah, that's a good book.
Okay, so that would actually help me out in the writing assignment?
Yeah, oh well.
Okay, thank you.
Even if you read the book itself, the one that you have by Carball, it has a lot of good points that you can actually borrow from Carball. Chapter 10 and chapter 16, I guess, 10 and 16.
I know this is not an English class, but does it have to be like in MLA format or?
No, no,
Okay.
no, doesn't have to. As long as you provide a cover page with your name, the title of the paper, the date, the course number, and the section number, then you're fine.
Okay.
You don't need to have any abstract, all of that, those type of things are relegated towards writing a real professional paper that you want to publish, basically. But for our purposes, it's just going to be a 3-page paper. Make sure that it is well organized in terms of introduction, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, bibliography. That's what you need to do. So make sure that your paper is well structured and well organized. Very important. If you do that, then you're fine. What's that?
We still have to have a reference page.
Yes, at the end.
Okay.
Okay, so let's move on. Today, what we want to do is we want to look at the large nation model. In other words, we want to find out how will a tariff affect the economic welfare of a large country if the country that's imposing the tariff is a large country. And we will see that there are some differences between the large country model and the small country model in terms of the impact of the tariff on economic welfare. Now, if you remember, when we talked about the small country model, we said that the country is so small that it cannot affect the world price. It takes the world price as given. And based on those assumptions, we were able to show that, first of all, the tariff will increase the price of the product, and it will increase it by exactly the amount of the tariff. And we also found that the consumer in the small country will pay all of the tariff. And then we showed that there will be 4 separate effects of the tariff. There will be what we call the redistribution effect, the protective effect, the revenue effect, and the consumption effect. So all those effects will take place as a result of the tariff. And we also showed that consumer surplus will be impacted negatively as a result of the tariff. And we saw that the tariff will always lead to dead weight loss. So in fact, there are real costs to the tariff. The real cost of the tariff is the dead weight loss. Or sometimes we refer to the dead weight loss as economic inefficiency. So from here, we pretty much learn that it's a bad idea for any country to impose tariffs, because tariffs will always lead to dead weight loss and economic inefficiency. So why do you want to play with tariffs when you know that's exactly what a tariff would do? Well, later on, we'll probably discuss some of the reasons why, but by now, hopefully, all of you know why countries happen to impose tariffs, and it's all political more than anything else. In other words, you have lobbyists who would lobby the government to impose a tariff on textiles or on automobiles or on steel or whatever the case may be, because simply you'll find certain segments in society will be hurt by free trade, by competition. And as a result, they will resort to lobbying the government to impose tariffs to protect those particular industries that happen to be inefficient. And this is, the main reason why governments happen to enact tariffs, simply because of the pressure that they get from lobbyists who are pretty much determined to see that their own industry or their own interests are being protected by this tariff. That's about it. That's the main reason why countries happen to be enacting tariffs. And then, of course, for political purposes, you know how it is. Leaders would tend to pretty much talk about this as something that is for the national interests, that we want to protect our industry, that we want to encourage people to produce more at home. These are the nationalistic reasons why political leaders may want to take that route, because they feel that it's going to help them for the simple reason because they are painting themselves are the saviors of the interests or security of a particular country. But, it's all jargon more than anything else. But from an economic point of view, it really doesn't amount too much in as far as economic efficiency is concerned. In other words, by protecting industry, you're only hurting economic efficiency at home. You're really not doing anything else besides that. But anyway, so those are some of the things. Now, going back to the tariff. Let's see what we have now with the tariff. And I guess right there, it's simply repeating what I've been saying, so I'm really not going to go through that. Here is the model. This is the important thing right here, in as far as the large country model. And this really has to do with the US as the large country that happens to be importing autos from Japan. So this is the demand for automobiles in the US. That's why we call it DD, domestic demand. And this is the supply curve for producing autos in the US. And we call this domestic supply. Now the point of intersection will give us the autarky equilibrium, whereby with no trade, the price of autos in the US will settle at $9,600 per car, and consumers will purchase 70 million cars or 70,000 or whatever the case may be. It all depends on what we're measuring here. But let's say 70 cars. And domestic producers will produce 70. So again, under autarky, production is equal to consumption. Okay. Now let's say that the US decides to engage in free trade. When the US does that, then the US now will be facing a new supply curve that will combine the domestic and the rest of the world. So here, if we're talking about two countries being the world, which is the US and Japan, then this would basically be the supply curve of both the US and Japan put in one. When you do that, you will get a supply curve that is upward sloping. Now, this is very much different from the supply curve that a small country faces. Small country faces a horizontal supply curve, which is perfectly elastic. In our case, the world supply curve is no longer horizontal. It's no longer perfectly elastic, but it is rather elastic, upward sloping. Now you can see here, domestic supply is relatively inelastic, whereas the world supply is relatively elastic. And the reason is simply because here we're talking about the supply of one country, which is the US. So the US really doesn't produce that much automobiles because they really don't have a competitive advantage in it. As the model is telling us, Japan is the one that has a competitive advantage in autos. So obviously the supply, and as far as autos, are pretty much limited. And as shown by the supply curve, this steeper supply curve, prices are going to be much higher in the US. Whereas for the world, there's much more supply of automobiles at a much lower price. And as a result, we tend to get a much flatter world supply curve. Is this understood so far?
Yes.
Very good. Now, we want to find out what is the free trade equilibrium once the US engages in trade with Japan. And that will be determined by the intersection of demand and the world supply curve, which is right here. And we will call this point F, free trade equilibrium. So at the free trade equilibrium, we happen to purchase 110 cars. That's how much the US want to purchase at the price of $8,000. So the world price will be determined where the supply and demand intersect, and this will be 8,000. And at a price of 8,000, US consumers will say, okay, at this price, we're willing to purchase 110 cars. Okay, so how much do you think will be produced in the US? Anyone?
$30.
Very good. 30 cars will be produced in the US. How did you find that?
You find the F point, you go to the left and it intersect with the SD, that upward curve, and that's the point. You find that.
Very good. That's exactly what it is. In other words, when you know what the world price is, all what you need to know is the position of the domestic supply curve. Because remember what we said about the supply curve. The supply curve is nothing but a roadmap for domestic producers. In other words, this SD, domestic supply, is nothing but a roadmap for domestic producers. It simply tells them how much they're willing to produce at each price. That's the definition of a supply curve. That's what a supply curve is. It shows the relationship between the price and the quantity that producers are willing to produce at that price. So in other words, if the price happens to be $9,600, then producers will be willing to produce 70 because that's what the supply curve is telling them. Let's say if the price happens to be 8,800, then the supply curve would tell domestic producers to produce only 50, and so on. So there is a lot of points on the supply curve. Each point will refer to a given price and a given quantity produced and supplied. Is this understood? Does everyone understand how we got the amount that will be produced domestically once we know what the price is?
Yes.
Very good. So now we know at the world price how much we want to purchase, and we know at this world price how many US firms would want to produce. So from these two pieces of information, can we tell what the import is going to be?
Yes.
How much is the imports?
80.
Very good, 80, which is simply 110 minus 30, which is 80. So this is exactly how much we will be importing. Okay. Now, once we have determined that, now what we want to know is what is the consumer surplus? Can someone define what the consumer surplus is by looking at that graph?
Would it be from point F, like to the left and then up,
Very,
below the demand line?
very good, excellent. That's what your consumer surplus is going to be. It's going to be everything that lies above the market price, which is $8,000, because that's what the world price is, 8,000. So anything above this and below the demand, and you can take the demand all the way up until it intersects the y-axis or the vertical axis. Obviously, you know, the author is not showing it here, but that's what it is. This would be your consumer surplus. All of that. Okay. Now, let's say that domestic producers feel the pinch with this free trade, and they will get together and lobby the government to give them some protection by putting a tariff. And the government agrees. So the government decides to place a $1,000 tariff on cars. So for every car that comes in, consumers would have to pay $1,000 extra. Okay, so how will this tariff change the dynamics? What this tariff would do is that it would shift the world supply curve vertically up by $1,000. So in other words, if I were to measure the vertical distance between these 2 points, it will be 1,000. If I want to measure the vertical distance between these 2 points, it will be 1,000. The vertical distance between these 2 points, it will be 1,000. The vertical distance between these 2 points, it will be 1,000. Okay? All across. That's by how much the world supply curve will shift, will decrease it will shift upward by exactly the amount of the tariff. Now, once we do that, once we shift the supply curve by 1,000, then we're going to see where the new supply curve intersects the demand. And we will find that it will intersect demand at point G. This point G will tell us that the new price now is 8,800, and consumers will consume or will purchase 90 cars at the price of 8,800. How about domestic producers? How many cars will domestic producers produce?
50.
50 cars. Very good. So how much are we going to be importing?
40.
Very good. 40, which is 90 minus 50, which is 40. So now we pretty much know what the new price is. We know how much will be purchased. We know how much will be produced, and we know how much will be imported. So all this information is very important. Now, the next thing we want to do before we go any further, we want to see what is the new consumer surplus. Anyone?
Everything above 8,800?
Yes, and below the demand, right?
Below the demand.
Yeah. So my new consumer surplus is going to be all of this area right here. I wish I could color this. I really don't know how to do that. But if we were, or I don't know. I mean, I could, but it's going to take some time. Now we've got to go back to documents and insert and do all of that. So it's time consuming basically. But anyway, all of this would be your consumer surplus now. So now if I were to ask you, what is the change in consumer surplus? By how much has consumer surplus decreased? What would be your answer?
By A, B, C, and D.
Very good. A, B, C, and D. That's how much consumer have lost. They have lost all of that. And what would be the deadweight loss here?
Is it B and D?
Very good. B and D. That's your deadweight loss. And what is C?
Is there the revenue that we made?
Tariff revenue, you mean?
Yes.
All tariff revenue?
Isn't it government tariff revenue? Like the money that the government makes from the tariff?
Yeah, but is it all the tariff or just part of the tariff?
Just part of it.
Part of the tariff, and we will explain the reason why in just a minute. But that will be part of the tariff that the government gets from consumers. That's why we label it C. Tariff paid by the consumer. Now remember what we said earlier on. We said that under a large country model, the tariff is shared by consumers and foreign producers. So the consumer will pay part of the tariff, foreign producers will pay the rest. Now, how do we know how much tariff the consumer will pay and how much tariff the foreign producer will pay? All of that will depend on the elasticities of demand and supply. Remember from your principles of micro, when you studied the effect of taxes, because tariff is basically a tax. And I'm sure that your professor taught you or explained to you or went through the exercise of showing that when the demand curve is perfectly inelastic, in other words, it's vertical. When the demand curve is perfectly inelastic, the consumer will end up paying all of the tariff.
Wait,
And
I'm sorry,
when,
could you repeat that?
yes, when demand is perfectly inelastic, the consumer will end up paying all the tariff. And when demand is perfectly elastic, in other words, if you have a demand that is horizontal, perfectly elastic, then the producer will pay all of the tariff. So now, based on those two extremes, whether the demand is perfectly inelastic or perfectly elastic, you know exactly on whom the tax burden will fall. Now, the more inelastic the demand, the more the consumer will pay. The more elastic the demand curve, the more the producer will pay of that tariff. So that's demand. Now let's come to supply. Supply is completely the reverse, by the way. Now let's say the supply curve happens to be perfectly inelastic. In other words, vertical line, perfectly inelastic. That's the supply. All of the burden will fall on whom?
The producer?
Very good, the producer, because remember what we said. Now we will see exactly the reverse happening. Demand and supply, exactly the reverse. So when the supply curve is vertical, when the supply curve is perfectly inelastic, all the tariff will fall on the producer. Now, when the supply curve is perfectly elastic, meaning it's horizontal, all the tariff will fall on whom?
The consumer?
The consumer. Very good. So now you got it. And now, once you know this, then you know exactly what would happen to the tariff and who's going to pay more of it. Is it the consumer or the producer? And as I said, it all depends on the elasticities of demand and supply. So the first thing I need to do is find out how elasticity, and as far as demand and supply, is determined. Now, we said that the consumer will happen to pay most of the tariff if the supply happens to be relatively elastic. And this is exactly what we have right here. The supply is relatively elastic, right? It's flat, rather not completely flat, but it's rather flat, so it's very elastic. It's not like the supply curve here. This is more steeper, this is more inelastic. Now the world supply is relatively flat, very elastic, so what can we conclude from this when it comes to tariffs? Will the tariff fall more on producers or more on consumers?
Consumers?
Very good, more on consumers, as we will see in just a minute, simply because supply is relatively elastic. Most of the tariff will fall on consumers. Okay, now let's go back to the question in hand here. Who's going to be paying the tariff and how much will each pay? Well, as we can see from here, because the supply is relatively elastic, we know that most of the tariff will be paid by consumers. But by how much? Well, first of all, I need to compare these two equilibrium points, F and G. Under free trade, the consumer happens to be paying $8,000. After the tariff, the consumer happens to be paying $8,800. And we know that the tariff is 1,000. So how much of the tariff is the consumer paying? $80% or $800, because the tariff is $1,000, the consumer is paying $800. Therefore, the consumer is paying 80%. If I know the consumer is paying 80%, then I know the foreign producer will pay how much?
200?
Very good, which is in percentages?
20%?
20%.
20%. There you have it. So the consumer ends up paying more of the tariff. Now, again, go to point F and point G. Now, if you really want to find out how much the foreign producer will be receiving for the product after the tariff is imposed, all what you need to do is bring this line down perpendicularly all the way down to the supply curve, original supply curve. And this will tell you exactly how much the foreign producers will receive for each auto that it sells to the US. So you can see from here that the foreign producer will be receiving 7,800, whereas before, under free trade, the foreign producer was receiving 8,000. So the foreign producer is actually paying $200. Or, in other words, the foreign producer has agreed to lower the price from 8,000 to 7,800. And the reason why the producer is doing this, because this producer is dealing with a large country, a large market, the US, whereby the US happens to be buying most of the car that Japan produces. And in this case, obviously, we're talking about two-country world, so Japan, the only place they have to sell their cars is the US. Therefore, in order to maintain its share of the market, Japanese firms will have no choice but to reduce their prices so that the reduction in prices can act as a cushion to the high impact tariff on autos. In other words, the reduction in prices will reduce the fall in demand for Japanese autos. It will reduce demand, yes, because the price will go up anyway as a result of the tariff. But prices will only go up to 8,800. If Japan did do nothing about its price, in other words, kept its price as is, then prices obviously are going to go up way above 8,800. And for that reason, as you can see from here, Japan will pay part of the tariff, which is 20% or 200, and that will be summarized in this area that we call E, which is the terms of trade effect. Now, the terms of trade effect is simply defined. In other words, how do we define the terms of trade? Anyone? What is our definition of the terms of trade? It's simply
Is
defined.
demanded the world price?
No, it is simply defined as the export price index divided by the import price index. This will be the terms of trade for the US. Each country has its own terms of trade index. So if we want to look at the terms of trade index for the US, then this will be defined as the export price index of the US divided by the import price index of the US. Now, for the US, we're going to assume.
Professor,
Yes.
is that the openness formula?
What's that?
Is that what you just say, the export price index divided by import price index, is that equal to the openness formula?
No. That's the terms of trade index.
Okay.
That's known as the terms of trade index. The
Okay,
openness
thank you.
index is completely different. The openness index simply looks at exports plus imports divided by GDP.
Oh, yeah, right.
So this is completely different story here. Okay, so the terms of trade index for the US is export price index divided by the import price index. And we're assuming here that the price of exports for the US stays the same, because here we're really not looking at what the US is exporting. So we're going to assume that it stays the same. However, the import price index for the US has done what? Go up, go down, stay the same. What can you say about the import price? Anyone?
It went up.
What's that?
It went up, maybe?
No.
Nope, just kidding.
Yeah, all right. Good try. The price went down. Why? Because Japanese auto manufacturers have reduced the price of autos. So you can see from 8,000 to 7,800. So the price of automobiles went down. Now we know the market price of automobile is 8,800, But you got to take 1,000 away from that because that's tariffs. So the world price of automobile basically is 7,800 instead of 8,000. And then what the US has done is that it had obviously put $1,000 tariff on this. So with the $1,000 tariff, now the new world price would be equal to 8,800. So from here we know that the terms of trade index for the US has increased, which means the terms of trade for the US have improved, which is a good thing. That's basically what a tariff would do for a large country. It can actually help it influence the world price. It helps it to convince Japan to reduce its price to the US. So a large country in this sense will gain by having a lower price. Now you may say, well, this doesn't make any sense really. Why would the country gain? Because after all, the consumer is ending up paying a higher price, correct? This is what most of you would say. And you're absolutely right. The consumer really didn't make any gain. So who made the gain here?
Was it the government?
Very good, the government. The government gained $1,000 on each automobile sold. So now, if the government is going to use those revenues for the general economic welfare of the people, then the country as a whole will be better off, right? In other words, the government can use that money to create more social programs, to build more schools, more hospitals, more roads. It could use part of that money to reduce taxes on the people, income tax. So there are all things that the government can do, which would ultimately impact consumers indirectly, positively. That's why we say that a large country, by imposing a tariff, could in fact end up a winner. So this is basically known as the terms of trade effect. Can we find what that is in dollar terms? The terms of trade effect?
It's the area of the rectangle, right?
Very good. And how much is that in dollars? It's 8,000, correct?
Yeah, 8,000.
$8,000. And how much is this area C? It's 32,000, right?
Yes.
So 8 plus 32, that's 40,000. That's exactly the amount of the tariff that the government gets. Why? Because we are importing 40 units and we are putting $1,000 on each unit. So tariff revenue is going to be 40,000, which is this whole area right here. This is the total tariff revenues. C is the portion paid by the consumer. E is the portion paid by the foreign producer. Does everyone follow so far?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, how do we find area A?
The area of A and B minus the area of B.
Very good. So if you want to find area A, all what you need to do is find this whole area, A plus B minus B will give you A. So that's very simple. So now we know how to find A, we know how to find B, we know how to find C, we know how to find D, and we know how to find E. And that's all we need for exam purposes. Oh, those are the only areas that you will be asked to find. Now, if you are asked to find what is the real cost of the tariff, what's the real cost of the tariff for a large country? Anyone?
Either B or D, right?
No. What's the real cost of the tariff for a large country? Now, for a small country, we found it to be B plus D, correct? That's the real cost of the tariff. For a small country, B plus D. How about for a large country?
C and E, right?
No. The real cost is B plus D minus E. That would be the real cost of the tariff. Now, if E happens to be greater than B plus D, then the overall effect of the tariff will be positive. In other words, the country will be better off by imposing a tariff, because the terms of trade effect pretty much in other words, it pretty much overcompensated for the B plus D. If E happens to be greater than B plus D, then the country's general economic welfare is better off. If E is equal to B plus D, then there is no change in economic welfare as a result of the tariff. If E happens to be less than B plus D, then there is a worsening of economic welfare as a result of the tariff. Does everyone understand that?
What do you call B plus D minus E? The economic effect, what was it again?
Yeah, it is the overall effect of the tariff on economic welfare. Overall effect of the tariff on economic welfare. In other words, when you come to determine the real cost of the tariff, the real cost can be either negative, zero, or positive. If the real cost happens to be negative, then obviously the tariff has negatively impacted economic welfare. It has worsened economic welfare. If the real cost happen to be equal to zero, then there's no change. If the real cost happens to be greater than zero, positive, that simply means that the tariff is really doing something good for the country. So it all depends on E, B, and D. That's why we say that it is very possible for a tariff to actually affect positively the economic welfare of a country. If that tariff is being imposed by a large country, and if that tariff leads to the terms of trade to dominate the deadweight loss. If the terms of trade dominates the deadweight loss, then the country would be better off as a result of the tariff. Understood?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
So you really need to determine the area E, what is E, and you need to compare it with areas B and D. So if this area happens to be greater than B and D, then you say, hey, it's a good idea to impose a tariff by this large country. If E happens to be exactly equal to B and D, then really there is no change. It really doesn't matter whether the country imposes this tariff or not. So you're not adding anything, and it's not taking away anything. But if E happens to be less than B and D, then you know that things have worsened. This takes us now to the idea of what an optimum tariff is. Let's see here if the book really looks at that as well. So in other words, it tells you everything that we just talked about in here. So you see right there, if E happens to be greater than B plus D, national welfare is increased. If E happens to be equal to B plus D, national welfare remains constant. And if E is less than B plus D, then national welfare is diminished. And this is exactly what we talked about. Now, let's look at the optimum tariff. And what is the optimum tariff? The optimum tariff is simply defined as a tariff that will lead to the difference between the terms of trade and the deadweight loss to be at its maximum. If we reach that position, then we know that the tariff we are imposing is an optimum tariff. So again, let's see how your book defines it. The optimum tariff maximizes the positive difference between the gain of the improving terms of trade, which is area E, and the loss in economic efficiency, which comes from the protective effect, area B, and consumption effect, area D. And this is exactly what I said. In other words, maximizing the difference between the deadweight loss, which is defined by areas B and D, and the terms of trade, which is defined by area E. So whenever you get the difference between these two to be the maximum, then you know you have reached the optimum tariff. And the optimum tariff obviously is only going to be beneficial to the importing nation. The exporting nation is going to lose big time from this optimum tariff. Why? Why would the exporting nation lose? Someone.
Is it because they have to lower their prices and the demand for their product is decreasing as well?
Well, yes, the first point, you're right, and the second point follows, of course, but The thing here is this country will be forced to lower the price of its export to the minimum point possible, where it really becomes break even. So obviously this country is not going to be gaining anything. You're not giving an opportunity to this country to benefit from trade. And this is what an optimum tariff would do. Sometimes an optimum tariff is referred to as beggar thy neighbor policy. In other words, what you're doing with this optimum tariff is you're making your trading partners extremely poor, that ultimately they will not be able to afford to buy your goods anymore. So this beggar thy neighbor policy will not work. It will backfire. And the reason is simply because if you're going to do that, then you're going to be inviting retaliation from other countries. Other countries will start doing the same. They will also try to look for their optimum tariff. And they will try to make you poor too. So luckily, this beggar than neighbor policy will never work, which is good for trade. Because if this beggar thy neighbor policy is allowed to take place, then it will ultimately lead to what type of situation or what type of equilibrium? Anyone should be able to answer this. It will lead ultimately to an autarky equilibrium. What does that mean, autarky?
Trade is absent.
Exactly, absence of trade. And when there is absence of trade, what happens to the use of our resources?
Not used efficiently.
Very good. They will not be used efficiently. So when our resources are not being used efficiently, what will this lead to? Economic inefficiency. Less goods and services produced. Higher costs. Higher prices. Is this the world we want to live in? Is this what we want to have?
No.
Of course not. The answer is not. So the answer would take you back to trying to make trade as free as possible. However, countries must respect the rules of trade. In other words, the playing field must be leveled for all countries. You cannot have some countries take advantage of the rules of trade at the expense of other countries. If we are able to do that, then the world obviously will be a much better place to live in, and the world will be much more efficient, of course, and prices will be a lot lower, and more goods and services will be traded. And this is the way. This is the advantage of free trade. But obviously, it's a lot simpler said and talked about in theory and in textbooks than it is done in reality. Because the real world is very complex. And in the real world, there are so many variables. that we need to take care of. And the real world is not well described by perfect competition. Because of all these issues, it's really very, very, very difficult to have a level playing field. And for that reason, sometimes it's very, very difficult to actually have free trade, basically. And that's, you know, I don't know, I have my phone here next to me, and I guess sometimes when I say a few things, Siri thinks that I'm asking her to answer some questions for me. So that's why you probably hear sometimes, you know, anyway. So that's basically the reason why free trade does not work in the real world. Because of all of these limitations and all these variables working at the same time. Now, how do we go about finding the optimum tariff? Now, I guess your book really doesn't talk about that, and the book I don't think explains it, even though I try to, you know, explain it in my book. The chapter that I'm writing on this one, I do go into details explaining what the optimum tariff is, but obviously your book doesn't, and since we're using your book, I really don't want to bother you with too many details. But one thing that you need to know here is that the optimum tariff is simply, you may want to write this down, or let me see if I can write it here as well, so you can, the optimum tariff is basically equal to 1 over the, let me write this down instead of writing it in symbols, but I'll just write it in words. 1 over the price elasticity of supply. That's the optimum tariff. So let's say, for example, if the price elasticity of supply of our imports is equal to, let's say, 10, this is highly elastic. What would be the optimum tariff? What's that? Speak up, I can't hear you.
Would it be 10%?
Yeah, 10%, very good. That would be the optimum tariff, 10%, highly elastic. How about if the price elasticity of demand of supply happens to be 0.25, which is very inelastic? What would that be? 400%? Correct? That would be the optimum tariff, 400%. If the price elasticity of supply happens to be relatively inelastic, if it's equal to 0.25, then the optimum tariff will be 400%. So do you see how you can compute the optimum tariff?
Yes.
Very good. So this is one thing that you could obviously see in the exam. By the way, optimum tariff, given the price elasticity of supply, you would be asked to find what the optimum tariff is. And then, just using this formula, you should be able to find what the optimum tariff is. Okay, we're going to leave it right there. And if there are any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them for you. But then remember, there's always office hours that you can Zoom with me. And I'm sure most of you will do that before the midterm exam. But if there are any questions right now, I'll be more than happy for those who want to stay for a couple of minutes and have your questions and answers.
Thank you.
Okay.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
I'm not sure if it says in the syllabus or not, but do you accept late work at all?
No,
Okay.
no late work. Any other questions?
Professor?
Yes. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just saying thank you. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Anyone else? Go ahead.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Professor. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care now. And I will see you on Tuesday. Have
a nice weekend.
You too. Have a nice, wonderful weekend, all of you. And I'll see you again on Tuesday. Bye-bye.
All right. Thanks, Professor.
Thank you.